All right. Omar Shakir serves as the Israel and Palestine director at Human Rights Watch, and he investigates human rights abuses in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. Welcome, Omar.
Thanks for having me.
You're in Amman because essentially you were kicked out of Israel at one point.
That's correct. I was based there for my work for 2.5 years, and the Israeli government, as part of a years-long campaign against Human Rights Watch, ordered me deported. They alleged that I support the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. We challenged that in the court system. I was able to stay another year and a half while that pended, but ultimately the court upheld the government's interpretation of the anti-boycott law to apply to human rights advocacy, calling for businesses not to abuse human rights. So I was deported in the end of 2019 and have been working outside Israel-Palestine since.
So the divestment scheme, maybe you can just explain it, but because that is essentially what is driving the debate in American universities right now, too. Right? I mean, students are demanding that universities divest. Can you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I think the debate on university campuses right now is about the nature of U.S. possible complicity in Israel's grave crimes taking place in Palestine, including the provision of arms to the Israeli government, but also in the case of universities, it's their endowments which are invested in a range of companies that do business either in the occupied territory or that have agreements with abusive arms of the Israeli government. And so when it comes to Human Rights Watch, we don't take a position one way or another on boycott calls because ultimately our advocacy is catered towards duty bearers. So we call on states and companies and others that have rights obligations or duties to not abuse rights, to not be complicit in rights abuses. So, in the case of Israel-Palestine, we've called for businesses not to operate in or with settlements because doing so makes you invariably implicated in the grave human rights abuses that stem from settlements, which are war crimes, violations of international humanitarian law. We have also said that companies should avoid all forms of complicity in apartheid, which we've documented, and in the atrocities. We've documented grave abuses, including war crimes, taking place in Gaza. And certainly students are articulating their own demands, which also in some cases relate to questions of complicity and calling for the university to act to ensure that they're not complicit one way or another as students in their university's actions.
Right. There's a lot in there. You've packed a lot in there, and I don't want to break it all down because the whole conversation will go in that direction. But obviously, if you're pro-Israeli, you believe that the state is being threatened by things like Hamas's attack in October the 7th, you would believe that it's right for America to keep supplying weapons to Israel. The debate then becomes how those weapons are used, where those weapons are used. Are they used against defeating terror, or are they used on a civilian population?
Look, I mean, I think there are many strands of what pro-Israel is, right? I mean, I think there are many that are supportive of the Israeli government, but have concerns about their human rights abuses and concerns about U.S. weapons that may be contributing to grave abuses or that are being transferred at a time in which the Israeli government is committing atrocities. There are some that would subscribe to that view. There are obviously some that would say, well, maybe Iron Dome is in a different category than, providing artillery or providing, firearms that might go to settlers or JDM, bombs that are used in Gaza. So there are some in the pro-Israel camp that would, maybe debate about what the kind of weapons. And yeah, there are others that would be defensive of any sort of conditionality or restrictions. But
So does
I think the important point.
Human Rights Watch line up in the camp that says no weapons at all to Israel?
Human Rights Watch has been very clear, and this is around the world. It's not unique to Israel. Anytime there's a risk that the weapons, will be used for the commission of serious abuses, anytime we've documented a practice of systematic rights abuse, we call for an arms embargo. We call for arms to be cut off, to be suspended, so long as those abuses continue. That is our position in the case of Israel-Palestine, that there should be a suspension on arms and military transfers to the Israeli government, so long
That
as
would
the Israeli
essentially strip
government.
Israel of its ability to defend itself from anything. I mean, do away with helicopters, you do away with F-16s, you would do away with 155 millimeter artillery that defends different borders. I mean, it's very hard to parse all of that, isn't it?
It's not really actually, because at the end of the day, the first assessment is whether or not you're giving weapons to a country committing war crimes and grave abuses of human rights. If you're doing so, there is a risk that you are going to be complicit in those abuses. So the
Yeah.
first duty of a state is non-complicity. We're talking about Israel that has its own arms industry. It has very advanced weapons. We're not talking about, any other situation. We're talking about countries like the United States asking themselves whether or not the supply of weapons to a state committing, and this is very well documented that they're committing war crimes. The International Court of Justice
Yeah.
has even said that claims that the rights of Palestinians under the Genocide Convention
You
are
know that
plausibly being violated.
Israel supplied weapons to Palestinians as well.
I mean, look,
They gave the Palestinian Authority weapons.
and Human Rights Watch has actually also said that weapons abuse of arms to the Palestinian Authority should stop given the risk, given the serious abuses we've documented. This is not about
Right.
cutting, we've also said the same thing, by the way, about Hamas. We've called on states that supply weapons to
Like
Palestinian
Iran,
armed groups that are committing unlawful attacks. Those should stop so
including
long as they
Iran.
continue to commit abuses. So this is I covered Egypt for Human Rights Watch. We made the same recommendation about arms to Egypt. So we're very consistent, and Israel's held to the very same standard.
Including Iran. Sorry, maybe you couldn't hear me, but Iran supplying weapons to Hamas, Iran supplying
Yes,
weapons
we've
to
been very
Hezbollah
clear.
and
We
Lebanon.
specified Iran when it
All right,
comes to provision of weapons to Hamas in our
all right. That
publication.
that
Very
hasn't
clearly, that should stop.
that hasn't worked too well. But I mean,
Well,
so
it's
the
not worked with the U.S. and Israel either. The
yeah,
arms keep on coming despite the grave abuses. So ultimately, our call is the same to everybody that we need to stop supplying arms that have a risk of contributing to grave rights abuses, whether it's Iran to Hamas or the United States to Israel. We're talking about a very different scale of provision of arms, but it's the same principle.
certainly a different scale. Look, I didn't invite you on to debate with you, but, and I don't, and I hope it doesn't sound like I am, but there are obviously many different sides and different layers here. But let's return to the original question. Um, Somebody asked me the other day, is Gaza so much bigger than the West Bank? Which is strange, right? Because you and I both know that Gaza is so much smaller compared to the West
Yeah.
Bank geographically. The population is even smaller than the West Bank, but obviously Gaza seems so much larger. It looms so large right now because that's where the main conflict is taking place that we see um, through very narrow lens. What we see with between the IDF and Hamas and civilians caught in the crossfire. But can you tell me in the West Bank, which a lot of people don't understand, the violence has spiked in the West Bank as well. The operations by the IDF backing in some cases settlers who they're supposed to be in some cases policing but don't seem to be. It's a major problem for so many Palestinians who are not in Gaza, who were not involved in October the 7th, who are living in the West Bank under the rule of Israel, under military rule.
Yeah. It's funny. If you look at October 3rd, my colleagues in Geneva stood up on the floor of the Human Rights Council and literally gave a speech about the unprecedented violence happening in the West Bank. And that predated October 7th. And what we've seen happen since October 7th actually is an order of magnitude worse than what we saw happen in the months before October 7th. So look, when it comes to violence in the West Bank, you have multiple trends, all of which point in a damaging direction. One is what you mentioned. We see settler violence at a degree that's simply unprecedented. Multiple attacks per day. You have entire parts of the West Bank. You mentioned my deportation we started with. There are areas in the West Bank that I used to know as having Palestinian communities. You go there today and they are wiped off the map. They do not exist. Palestinian communities that have been
Like,
entirely
could you give me like one
depopulated.
example? And how big are
Yeah,
those? How big were those
yeah, these are
communities?
these are relatively small communities, but
Yeah.
we're talking about at least 7 that have been entirely depopulated. Some estimates are higher. We say people from 20 communities have been displaced. There's another estimate of an Israeli NGO that 18. But the areas I'm talking about are like the central West Bank. So if you look at the area starting a Highway 1, which connects Jerusalem and Jericho, north to like Duma, that's east of Mughayr and Ramallah, and west of Jericho, that area has been almost entirely depopulated of Palestinians. And then if you go to the South Hebron Hills, so this is, an area southwest of Hebron, again, you have an area where you have communities like Khurbat al-Rahim and
Right.
Khurbat Zannuta that you can find on a map several years ago that
Tell
aren't there
me,
today.
tell me how, first of all, they were depopulated, and can you then go to the why? What's really taking
Yeah.
place then?
So let's do that. The how, it's quite simple. It's been settler violence. So although these communities in many cases have faced years of home demolitions, denied access to water and electricity, the thing that forced them out ultimately is the fact that these communities are facing attacks by these herding outposts. So we're talking about them being assaulted, their livestock being killed, families being attacked at their homes, their cars burned, in some cases their homes burned, in some cases killings. So that level of settler, in many cases with Israeli soldiers standing by or even participating, that has succeeded where, and then, by the way, these communities, once they're displaced the day of an attack, we've documented how they've been unable to go back to their homes. In some cases, they've filed lawsuits. In some cases, they've tried to move back and
Mhm.
faced continued settler violence. So that's the how. It's the settler violence forcing them out because when a family has their livelihood, like their livestock killed, or their kids can't go to school, or others are not safe in their own homes, that's going to trigger the sort of action that all these other policies have felt. In terms of the why, for us, it's a pretty simple explanation. There's been years of impunity for these attacks, and you have very clear statements from senior Israeli officials like Itamar Ben-Gvir stating that commit the violence, you will not be held to account. And then this is happening in very strategic areas of the West Bank that settlement councils and other authorities have said they want to keep and maintain for use by Israeli settlers. So it's a confluence of these factors that is creating this unprecedented violence. And by the way, we didn't even get into the other layers of West Bank violence, which I can get to later, but this is just one facet of the repression in the West
This
Bank.
is because there are, radical right members of Netanyahu's cabinet who believe essentially that Israel should forever rule the West Bank and probably depopulate Palestinians if they can. I mean, that is not the majority of the Israelis. That is not the majority of the Israeli government. But these are, I mean, they hold cabinet posts.
Yeah, but look, I think you're right. And that's part of what we've documented. But this is not a new phenomenon. This is not something that started, a year and a half ago when this government came to power. This has been a decades-long pattern of unchecked expansion of settlements and impunity for settler violence. It happened under Gantz and Lapid. It happened under other Israeli governments. So yes, that's part of the issue, but this is not a few bad apples. This is a structure or a system that, I'll give you an example. If a settler attacks a Palestinian and the army is there, they do not have a mandate to protect Palestinians. Their mandate is to protect the settlers. It's the Israeli police, which is barely present in the occupied West Bank, that has the authority to protect Palestinians. So there's a structural gap that's there. And
This is,
then
you mean border police or
border
regular police?
police.
Border
Exactly.
police, because the regular police are not deployed there anyway.
I mean, it's complicated because but it's generally border police. Yes.
Generally, the
There are a
border
lot of
police.
joint operations.
Right. But I mean, I've been there in previous years where, in fact, the IDF would step in to settler violence, like in Hebron, for instance, where they, you have cells of Kahana High radical
Yeah.
right, where there have been massacres on Palestinians in the Hebron Mosque and elsewhere,
Well, Hebron's a
that
good
they would
example.
step in and they would separate settlers who were being aggressive. And I personally have seen settlers machine gunning homes and going down the street and just shooting randomly after an attack on settlers in that case.
Look, I mean, that's a good example of Hebron because they separate. So, but what does that mean in practice? In Hebron, it means entire sections of Hebron are off access to Palestinians that live there, and people who live in those communities where settlers are. They may be able to go and return to their homes, but they're not able to invite others. They're not able to sort of fully function. Many of them are then forced to leave. So the solution when they do so is to basically erect and further apartheid, to further this separation partition. So, but again, as a structural matter, the army's duty is to protect the settlers. So even when they are separating them, they're not, I mean, they're doing so out of a mandate to protect the
They're not
settler and not to
prosecuting, they're
protect the
not arresting.
Palestinians. They're not arresting settlers. Exactly. That's a good way to put it.
Okay. Israel would argue, and there's a lot of different chapters of this discussion, but they would argue that there was a lot of support for Hamas and the attack in the West Bank, something like 70% of Palestinians polled, and there are different polling, but around 70% of Palestinians support Hamas's attack on October the 7th, which is, I think a lot of us find remarkable. And for that reason, the IDF was going in and conducting operations in the West Bank to prevent a similar attack emanating from the West Bank as it did from Gaza. What would you say to that?
I would say by that logic, most Israelis support the bombardment of Gaza. So by your logic, Palestinian armed groups would have the same latitude to go and attack Israeli communities where there is high support for it. That's not how international law works. International works based on a separation between civilians and combatants. And the reality here is that, when it comes to the West Bank, you do not have, I mean, the center of hostilities have been in Gaza. In the West Bank, there have been different groups that have opposed the Israeli army, resisted, in some cases, used violence against Israeli forces. And, those should be, Israel under the law of occupation, has tools to deal with that. They can arrest the perpetrators. If they face an imminent threat to life, they can use lethal force. But that's really not what we're seeing, right? I mean, and when they do that, Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister in 2022, April, said there are no restrictions on the Israeli army. And so we've also seen a pattern of unlawful killings of Palestinians in the West Bank. Let's be clear, more Palestinians were killed in the West Bank in 2023, more than double than in any year since the UN began recording data on Palestinian killings in 2005. So in
Why?
18-year high, it's more than 2x as high. There have
Why?
also
And how
been
many? And could you give me a B part of your answer, which is not only the killings, but how many have been arrested since October the 7th? It's in the
a
thousands.
great point. It's also, yeah, you have it. Well, we don't know how, I don't know the exact number since October 7th, but you have, for example, about 9,000, according to the latest Israeli government data, Palestinian prisoners in detention. That doesn't include Gaza, but Gaza aside, just from West Bank, East Jerusalem. And about a third of those, about 3,500, depending on the day, are being held in administrative detention without trial or charge based on secret information. Many of them detained since October 7th. That number on administrative detention is about a 30-year high. Like if you compare before October 7th, it's again about 2x or more the numbers that existed at that point. So yeah, if we take a step back from all we've talked about, rising settler violence, rising killings of Palestinians, rising detention. So all of this creates a situation which obviously it's not like the scale of Gaza, but we are seeing the situation very much teetering, and there is a real concern that the situation will lead to much worse violence if we don't deal with some of these root causes.
Omar, does the policing of the West Bank by the Israeli army, and there are different units in the IDF, to be fair to the IDF. I mean, there are some that have been named by the American administration, I believe at least one brigade, where they want to impose sanctions, correct? There are there's a broad spectrum of IDF units operating there. Does the current situation lead to discussion of a two-state solution and a peace process, or does it just take us further and further away from any moderates that might deliver some kind of peace process between Israel and Palestinians?
I think the current reality highlights why the decades-long framework for talking about Israel-Palestine was misguided. Because while we kept talking about solutions and what they look like, we forgot about dealing with the problem that necessitates a solution. We forgot about the root causes: impunity for unlawful attacks, Israel's apartheid against Palestinians. There is some parts of Israeli society that have responded to October 7th by saying we can't go back to how things were, where we pretended that the Palestinian issue didn't exist, that we sort of, talked about annexation and moving forward and just erasing the Palestinian cause from the issue. Because ultimately, when you rule millions of people that are denied their fundamental rights, that isn't the basis for any long-term future. So look, I think all of this emphasizes why we need to deal with root causes, but in a very different way. We need to sort of center dealing with the human rights abuse and the repression. They cannot be dealt with as symptoms. They are the problem. So we need accountability for all the perpetrators, whether they be the October 7th attacks or, Israel's apartheid and grave repression against Palestinians. We need there to be an end to all forms of complicity by states, including, providing arms that could be used to commit serious rights abuses. There needs to be, the first step to solve a problem is to diagnose it correctly, right? The wrong diagnosis leads to the wrong policy prescription. So we need to start by, applying the right tools to understand that reality. And we have some processes underway at the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court. They're really important. And I think states should be supporting those processes and be taking other steps to prevent more atrocities.
So you really you would absolutely favor seeing the ICC indict Netanyahu and other members of the government for war crimes?
I am in favor of the ICC moving forward with against perpetrators of serious crimes. Let the evidence lead where it leads. The prosecutor has been looking at this for years. There are serious crimes that have been committed, not just by Israeli forces, but also by Palestinian armed groups. And those should all be looked at. And the prosecutor should bring charges against those for which there's evidence that they're implicated in crimes that fall under the Rome Statute.
A dark state of affairs, which while the Americans and others and European governments are talking about, let's move forward to a two-state solution, let's find a long-term plan to allow Palestinians to exist side by side with Israel. You have Israel poised right now to invade Rafah in Gaza. What is that? And I know we're out of time, but I want to end with that because it's probably where we're heading. What is that going to do if Israel moves into Rafah and tries to, extinguish Hamas in the terminology of the Israeli government and Netanyahu?
I think a Rafah incursion, when there is no safe place to go in Gaza, and when you have more than 1 million displaced Palestinians there, would be catastrophic and unlawful. There is no safe place to go in Gaza. Much of the population of Gaza is there because Israel told them to go there because everywhere else was under sustained attack. There is nowhere else to go. And so I agree with you. This is where we have to end because a Rafah incursion would be catastrophic and states must take action to prevent further mass atrocities. Lives hang in the balance. And by the way, it's not just Palestinian lives. You have the families of Israeli hostages that are taking to the streets of Tel Aviv. You had one, on Thursday, May 2nd, where, families were saying it's either Rafah or the hostages. The hostages should be immediately and unconditionally released, irrespective of what happens on the ground. But they understand that an incursion like this could very well threaten not just Palestinians, but also
Netanyahu, though, at the same time, in parallel with that, is saying Rafah is going to happen no matter what. Release the hostages, but we're still coming after Hamas.
But I think it points to the fork in the road that's here. I think the coming weeks and months may well be determined by whether or not this incursion. And let's also not make it like it's a binary question because Israel continues to carry out airstrikes and other incursions there. So, even if it's not a full-scale invasion, it could still have very damaging consequences for the population.
Omar Shakir of Human Rights Watch, thank you so much. It's great to meet you and talk to you. I appreciate it very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, and feel free to reach out anytime.